The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
Proclamation of the Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked Jesus a question to test him. "Teacher," he said, "which commandment in the law is the greatest?" And Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, I'd like to offer you a challenge this morning. So are you ready for the challenge?
Yes.
Who said no? And the challenge is this. In the Gospel, Jesus asked, "What is the greatest commandment?" And as you know, the Jews had all kinds of commandments, all kinds of rules. 100, 200, 630 of them. 613 to be exact. And so here's this lawyer who says, "Okay, now I'm going to test Jesus. I'm going to find out. I'm going to find out what's the greatest of all these commandments." Think of all these commandments. He says, "What's the greatest? What's the best one?" And so Jesus says, "Well, here it is. You shall love your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul. And second, love your neighbor as yourself." There it is in a nutshell. Beautiful response. Beautiful response. That's the challenge that we had. How many of us here this morning can say, "Oh, that's what I do. I love God with all my heart, all my soul, my whole being. And I love my neighbor as I love myself." Not all of us are able to say that. But that's why we have to be able to look especially to the saints, because they're the ones that did this. Now, when we speak about love, we have to make a distinction here. It doesn't mean that you have to like everybody. Jesus did not like the scribes and Pharisees, but he still loved them. There are people, maybe there aren't, there are people in our lives that we don't like, but we are still asked to love them. That's the challenge. And that's the challenge, I believe, that all the saints took up. Yes. Teresa of Avila admitted at one time in her life that she spent the first 13 years of her life in religious life and as a very lax religious. So I say to myself, there's hope for me. And then you have St. Francis of Assisi. Here's an individual who looked at the life of Jesus, and he fell in love with Jesus. And so as a result of falling in love with Jesus, which the saints did, What he wanted to do was to imitate Jesus as perfectly as possible. So how is he going to do that? He looked to the gospel and he said, that's what I want to observe. I want to observe the gospel in everything. So that's what he did. And he became, as a result of that, the Christ of Umbria. He had many, many followers. And an offshoot of the Franciscan group is, of course, the Capuchins. And there was an individual by the name of Father Solanus Casey, who was born, he was born here in Wisconsin, Prescott, Wisconsin. And so he became acquainted with the Capuchins in Milwaukee area. And so he said to himself, well, I'm going to try. I'm going to try and become a Capuchin. So he entered the Capuchin community, and of course, as an Irishman, he had to somehow study, and our studies at the time were in German. So can you imagine? Here's this Irishman trying to figure out what these professors are talking about in German. So he had a very difficult time with his studies. And as a result of that, he became what is known as a simplex priest, which meant, at that time, there were a number of them, that they were not allowed to hear confessions, and they were not allowed to preach. But here was a man who so loved God, who so loved others, that he became a porter in Detroit, Michigan, and thousands of people came to him. And he performed marvelous miracles with these individuals. He touched the lives of so many people. He reached out to them. He loved children. He loved the poor. He loved every person that he came in contact with. So much so that at the end of his life, where he was suffering very, very intensely, his final words were, I give my soul to Jesus Christ. He gave his whole life in that way. And we marvel at somebody like that, because now, next month, we're going to have him beatified in Detroit at Ford Stadium, where there are going to be 66,000 people present for this beatification. And I could just see, because I lived with Solanus when I was a novice in Huntington, Indiana. I was a novice at that time, and he was there because he had to bring him to Huntington because there were so many people coming to him in Detroit. He said, well, we got to get him out of Detroit. So they brought him to Huntington. And one of the things that he loved to do was he loved to play the violin. But he was not a virtuoso. In fact, I always considered whenever he got off the violin, I said to myself, oh no, that was my penance period. But here was a man who was so humble, so loving, so outgoing, that he, didn't even grasp the fact that he was putting people not at ease. And you look at the lives of many individuals, many saintly people, and you see that this is what their characteristic, that they reach out to others. They're willing to do that. I just read of a Monsignor Harris from Arkansas. And you know what he does every other week? He travels 122 miles one way to a prison to visit prisoners who are on death row. And he reaches out to them. Marvelous. That's what you mean by love in action. Or some people, particularly when they had that hurricane in Houston, here was this man drowning in his truck, but they didn't have a rope to help him. So they came up with the bright idea, why don't we form a human chain to the truck? And in that way, we can be able maybe to save him. And that's what they did. But they put their lives at risk in doing that because the water, as you know, really rushes and moves very rapidly. But that's what they did, and they saved this man. Reminds me so forcefully of what Jesus said. No one had greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. And when you get to that particular point, then you know that you're loving God, that you're loving others with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. And that's our challenge. And never to get to a point where you say, that's enough. That's enough. I've loved enough. Because Jesus, as we know, on the cross said, into your hands I commit my spirit. He gave himself over totally to the Father. And that's our challenge, to be able to do that. To be able to reach out to others, to the hungry, the poor, the lonely, whoever they are, and to be able to show our love in that way. And the more you do it, the more that love is going to spill over in your life, almost like a chalice, and flowing over to others. So, the question is, can you accept the challenge?